Greetings, friends. Welcome to the Grit and Equity Talks podcast with G.R.I.T. I'm so excited to be here with you guys today. I hope that you've had a wonderful day. I hope that your New Year's has been wonderful. We are getting ready to, of course, go into February in a couple of weeks. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about grit. And I want to just touch on this because I know that as this new year has come in, we are still dealing with some crises. People are dealing with trauma. People are dealing with grief. And so I don't want let a moment like this pass without at least trying to comfort those that are listening and to provide support in the way that I can best. But before we get started, I do want to remind you of my social media handles so that you can follow me whenever you get a chance. So Facebook is Miss India White. LinkedIn is The India White. Twitter is Indie Speak and Teach. Instagram is Indie238. And my YouTube channel is India White 123. And TikTok is Dr. India White. I hope that you get a chance to follow me. Also, if you're wanting to be featured on the Grit and Equity Talks podcast, please make sure you schedule a consultation or you just send me an email at india.white.123@gmail.com. Please make sure that you're also doing your best to check out the other podcast episodes on the XFactor EDU podcast with Dr. Matthew Joseph, which is, of course, where this podcast is being hosted. Thank you so much, Dr. Matthew and the tribe, for this wonderful moment. Of course, if you are on this podcast, the whole objective is that if you're trying to close the achievement gap, but you're having classroom management issues, or you're trying to motivate students to do the work, then this is the podcast for you. But not only that, the topic I want to talk about today is overcoming trauma through grit. Now, why am I talking about this? Because yes, the school year has started, but coming back from break that are dealing with grief, dealing with trauma from accidents, health issues, and beyond. And so because of that, it puts us in predicaments where we have to handle these traumas as educators and as leaders to make sure that our students are still set up for success as they're trying to get through these tough situations in their lives. So first things first is I want to talk about what is trauma, things like that. I'm going to share my screen. So here you'll see it says, what is trauma? I am sharing my screen for you. So it says trauma is an emotional response that is caused by a distressing event series of events such as abuse, a bad accident, rape, or other sexual violence, combat, or a natural disaster. And it says just because a person experiences a distressing event does not mean they will experience trauma. Immediate reactions include mood swings, relationship challenges, flashbacks, physical symptoms. Professional support from a mental health professional, such as a psychologist or a psychiatrist, can help with coping and recovery. They list a bunch of types of trauma. This is from verywellhealth.com. And so it talks about just a lot of different, there's emotional trauma. So you have mental response or disturbing situation. There's acute trauma. There's a response and directly after an event. There's chronic long-term trauma. There's complex trauma, which it's related to multiple events. So something might have happened that triggered something else. And so there's those emotional types of trauma. And then, of course, there's physical trauma. So we have to be aware of these different types. It talks about acute emotional trauma is the emotional response that happens during and shortly after a single distressing event. And then a chronic emotional trauma is a long-term emotional response that a person experiences from a prolonged or repeated distressing event that spans for months or years. And so usually the complex emotional trauma, you're talking about an event that it may or may not be intertwined. I want to talk a little bit about some of the different types of traumas. They talk about traumas from childhood as well as adulthood. List is here of the different type of traumatic events that people go through. There's child abuse, there's child neglect, bullying, physical abuse, there's domestic violence, there's violence in the community, there are natural disasters, right? Hurricanes, tsunamis, whatever. There's medical trauma, sexual abuse, sex trafficking, substance abuse, intimate partner violence, verbal abuse. There's accidents, war, refugee trauma. Let's keep going on our list here. Terrorism, traumatic grief, So loss of a loved one, intergenerational trauma. And so it says, what are the symptoms of trauma? Let's keep looking here. It says the symptoms may be both emotional and physical. So it says the emotional response may lead to intense feelings that may impact a person's attitude, behavior, functioning, and their view of the world. A person that's going through post traumatic stress disorder, maybe they served in the war, maybe they served our country, or maybe they went through something, car accident or whatnot. It says when they go through this, there's an adjustment disorder. And so sometimes that can affect um, how they go forward in life. And it's characterized by a belief that their life and their safety is at risk with the feelings of fear, terror, or helplessness. So students are going through this, adults are going through this. And so it talks about psychological symptoms of emotional trauma, fear, helplessness, dissociation, changes in attention, concentration, and memory retrieval. There's difficulty functioning. There's denial or refusing to believe. Especially if you go through like the death of a loved one. There's anger. There's avoidance. There's depression, anxiety, mood swings, guilt or shame. And this just goes on. Blame, including self blame, social withdrawal, and emotional numbness, which is huge whenever you're going through trauma. To feel numb, like you don't know really how to process everything. They talk about physical symptoms of emotional trauma include increased heart rate, body aches, tense muscles. There's feeling on edge, having nightmares, difficulty sleeping, jumpiness, right? Being startled easily, fatigued, appetite changes, excessive alertness. And I want to say this because, people, it's so easy to assume like, oh, it's no big deal. Just let them get through it. That's, especially when you're a teacher or you're in education and you're trying to mold a child and that child has gone through trauma. It's so easy to dismiss that trauma. The child lost a pet, the child lost a relative, and it's like, oh, it's no big deal. They'll be fine. Well, I think that we do need to kind of retract and take that back and realize that it's not always okay and that it's okay to not be okay. And that we have to talk about this. I want to really talk about grief and trauma. This one is, very relative for me. Grief is the feeling of anguish related to the loss, most often the death of a loved one. Um, and the loss is not always death, and it talks about there's 5 stages of grief. You have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And we do want to get through to the acceptance phase, but I want to say this. I unfortunately have gone through much grief, and these are kind of interchangeable, these phases here. And it talks about how psychotherapy or talk therapy is a primary treatment for trauma. Be willing to talk about it, get it out. And it talks about how also there's mental trauma that you want to kind of work through and, it'll help you cope. And it says when to seek a professional help for trauma. You should definitely start seeking it, especially because they're talking about the risks of PTSD, depression, suicide attempts, anxiety, misuse of substances, and so on. So whenever you have a situation like that, definitely reach out for help. They have listed here suicide prevention hotline number. Never feel like you're alone because you're going through trauma. It's never easy, but just know that you're not alone. And so, with that said, I want to kind of go and talk with you guys a little bit more about some other findings that I found about how grit is actually something that can help you get through trauma, believe it or not. And so, I first want to talk about grit and what I found in this article from the National Medical Library. And they talk here, they say our results find or indicate that there's a significant relationship between higher grit scale scores and a lower self PTSD symptoms in EMS personnel. So they were interviewing and talking to EMS personnel that constantly are dealing with trauma. And this is what they found, that if they have a higher grit score, then they're going to be able to kind of cope and get through trauma better than those that did not have a higher grit score. I found that very interesting. Individuals who report more grit may develop mechanisms for coping with adversity that foster well-being and protect against psychopathology, which is what we just we just read. And then it talks about also, it says, alternatively, I'm going to show you the next part here. Alternatively, resilient individuals who persist in the face of obstacles and continue to pursue their passions. So they're more gritty, I guess. And it says their resilience, it leads to greater grit over time. I've told you, grit is great resilience and time. Grit is, it's like a liquid. It's it flows. It's up one day, down one day. You have grit levels, and you can, those grit levels, depending on how your outlook of life is, your positive um, affirmations, your support group, all of those things affect your grit levels. So I find this very interesting here that they're finding these results. And so it talks about also that grit scale scores in this article. It says the grit scale scores of medical residents, they predicted lower burnout and greater psychological well-being 6 months after their baseline assessment 13, and that higher grit scale scores are associated with lower. Looking here, it also talks about how grit, the grit scale score. So if you're wanting to see how grit was affected, it said the grit levels or the scale score, it was significantly negatively correlated with self distraction, denial, substance abuse, disengagement, religion, and self blame. This is when people are going through trauma or grief, that those factors affected grit negatively. Religion, self blame, disengagement, substance abuse, denial, self distractions, versus positive effects of grit were active coping and acceptance. So finding a way to cope, finding a way to accept it, finding a way to move forward, even though you're, really trying not to fall apart on the inside. Now, this here shows all of the different and their among grit, coping mechanisms, demographic variables, all the things they did with the EMS workers, and they found that the grit scale score, was significantly correlated with 8 scales of the brief cope. So this is an instrument that they're using, and so I found that very interesting. And it also says here that an additional implication of current data of their EMTs and paramedic workers with lower grit scales, it says they may need additional supports, including skills training to enhance coping strategies. And it talks about how there's a clear relationship between disengagement, self blame, substance abuse, which we talked about earlier, and decreased grit, and that emotional support was negatively support or associated with PTSD symptoms. And I find that very interesting. And I think that might be because if somebody's dealing with PTSD, there's so much that goes on there, and every case is different. So you can try to support them emotionally, and it can actually trigger a different response. So I found that very interesting. And then I wanted to talk with you guys more about this topic of really helping students with grit, because students have to understand that life has to continue going forward, but they also have to understand it's okay that if they need to pause and take a moment and deal with the situation, that they are human and they don't need to feel bad about that. But at the same time, they need a plan as to how to pick themselves up after they're done grieving, after they're done dealing with shock and an accident or surgery or hospital, whatever, or sickness. And I think that that is an area of focus for all leaders, is how can we equip our students when they're going through tough times to bounce back, and to know that, their life can still look smooth and hopeful moving forward, and that not all hope is lost, because they're going through some type of traumatic situation. So it's definitely an area of focus. So I've provided um, some tips that I kind of want to go over, and then I also want to look at some more research. Um, but before I talk about the tips, I wanted to point something out here about stress and how trauma has really affected our nation. So I found online, it says we cannot ignore the fact that we have been significantly changed by the loss of more than 1 million Americans, as well as a shift in our workplaces, school systems, and culture at large. And it talks about how basically stress has really affected people, and through stress, people are experiencing trauma. And so there's another APA.org where they're saying here as well, they're saying psychological science has revealed that long-term stress creates a risk of variety of mental health challenges, and it may make us feel more sensitive to daily hassles. So we have to keep things like that in mind. It talks about also, continuing on in this article, it says stress puts the body on high alert, and ongoing stress can accumulate, causing inflammation, wearing on the immune system, and increased risk of the host of ailments, including digestive issues, also including heart disease, weight gain, and stroke. So all of us deal with stress differently, and we just can't ignore it, just like they were saying earlier. So I wanted to provide some tips on how to deal with trauma through grit, and how to overcome trauma, how to help children that are dealing with the loss of a loved one, dealing with change in their dynamics, dealing with health situations. So here, tips for coping with trauma through grit. For one, and these are from me. You want to accept reality and know that you won't always have control. It's okay to realize that you cannot control every element in your life. And I think that, as you work with different people and different situations, all of that becomes very, very obvious. And I guess the longer we live, we start to figure that out as well. But children sometimes don't get that, and so sometimes we have to sit down and pull them to the side and talk to them, no matter their age, whether they're 4 years old or 14 years old. We have to have those conversations and let them know that it's okay to not be okay, and it's okay to not have full control. Um, Also, here, the next one, take moments of introspection. I would say definitely reflect on your life, reflect on what you're dealing with, and be honest about it. And then, forgive, forget, and plan to move forward. Now that you've reflected, how can you forgive? How can you forget? How can you plan to move forward? What does that look like? And I would say also consult your counselor or your support group to help get you through that. And then, of course, practicing work life balance, helping children to do the same. Sometimes you might have to help a child with an assignment and not put it all on them at once. Maybe you have to space it out, work with teachers, and figure out a plan to get that child through successfully despite their trauma and what they're dealing with. And I also wanted to kind of point out a situation that I know university leader, unfortunately, longer with us, and um, it talks about how, unfortunately, she was in a situation where she did not feel like she was set up for success. So she, took matters into her own hands, and she, unfortunately, is no longer with us. She took her life. And this is a very sensitive situation. Her name is Dr. Candia Bailey, and she was in Missouri. And the sad part about this situation is that she felt like she did not have support. Um, and I bring this up because children sometimes can feel very overwhelmed, like they need more support. And I'm thinking, if you have a rock star like this woman here who felt the stresses of life, and unfortunately was not able to overcome those stresses that were on her in her particular situation. Um, how do the children also feel when they are tasked with various mounting forces and obligations and you know expectations, and they are dealing with life, and there's no one to catch them, there's no one to help them. It's my hope that we can move forward with really choosing to love people, being cognizant of people's situations, and not just children, also your educators, your leaders, making sure that leaders aren't burned out. And if they are feeling like they need a day, a mental day, an emotional day, that could be granted to them, that we could practice grace and mercy with everyone so that we could just help each other get through this, because life is a maze, and there's no blueprint for it. And people are going to have highs and lows, and people deal with grief differently, people deal with trauma differently. And so we need to be cognizant of that, so that we don't lose any more warriors in the field. So I hope that this episode really has highlighted for you just all of the different things that it comes down to really helping students to overcome through grit. I can say that, um, from personal experience, when my brother passed away, and I had a math test, that teacher did not have me take the test that day. She understood that I just was not there. I was checked out. Not only that, my grade did not suffer because of it. And then she gave me the space I needed to heal and to pick myself back up as a student. And I'm sharing this with leaders so that if you're like, okay, well, then how do you help a kid get back into the swing of things? And so I think it was like 2 or 3 weeks later when I finally, returned back to school after the funeral and everything. And then I remembered, um, gradually, she approached me about, okay, I remember, you were supposed to take this test. And it was almost like, okay, are you ready to take it? Do you feel comfortable? She gave me an option that if I was like, well, I might need a couple days, she was willing to grant that. And so I think leaders need to definitely be mindful of that too, that as you're negotiating with students and you're helping students that are dealing with trauma and grief, if they're in the hospital, they're, just had surgery or something, that you're providing plethora of options for them to still be able to make up their work on time, to still be able to get, the learning that they need. If they're removed, maybe they're hospital homebound or whatever, giving them the opportunities that they need, so that they can still be set up for success, and just doing all of those various equitable practices so that, they're not going to fall behind because of a situation that's, out of their control. So with that said, I hope that you guys really enjoyed this episode. And, I think, for all of you, make sure that you're taking care of yourself, more than anything else, because you're irreplaceable. You're only one person. It's okay to have a low day. And I want to also say that, even if you're having a low time, life will bounce back. You will have a high time in the future. I also want to say, too, that if you're dealing with trauma, grief, and things like that, you do not have to dismiss it. You can own it. You can own how it makes you feel. But you also, I want to encourage you to also understand that life will move forward and that there's greatness waiting for you, on the other side of that trauma. So just continue to push through no matter what. And I just want to continue to stress self care, self love. Get rid of those negative thoughts. Get rid of all the things that make you feel like you're not valued or make you feel like you're a joke, or just get rid of those things, dismiss those things, table those things, because you don't have time for that. Okay, so with that said, I hope that you have been able to take this research and you know, um, these different findings and the stories that we've shared on here, and I hope that they're able to help you as you are working with students and you are helping to build, students and help students to overcome through grief. I also want to say this: whenever you help children, to make sure that you're still taking care of yourself and make sure that you're plugged into the community. Don't try to handle things all by yourself. Take advantage of the school psychologists, school counselors, guidance counselors, social workers, your support group, your administration team, the favorite coach, different people, different loved ones in the community that are there for that child. Because remember, we're trying to develop and help the whole child. We're concerned about the child, that they can get through those hard moments. And, because students spend so much time in school, it's imperative that we have a system where students feel like, yeah, I can trust the system. I know that they care for me. I know that I can go here if I have a problem. And, we never know what's going on. Students always need a safe place to be able to grieve, or a safe place to be able to open up and tell them, tell their leaders how they're really feeling and how, they're coping with different parts of their lives. And, sometimes they have up days, down days, and sometimes it's just everywhere and they need us. So, with that said, I hope that you have a system in place. And if you don't have a system, start asking yourself, what do we do, in situations, to prevent more trauma? What do we do to catch students that are going through trauma? What do we have set up? Do we have systems in place? Do we have supports in place? What resources do we have on campus? What resources do we have in our community? What resources are the district, leaders pushing out to help our students in every way? So I hope that you're able to, really navigate through those plans and come up with a great system. And then also making sure that you're taking care of yourself. There's only one you, you're irreplaceable. So don't try to put everything on your own shoulders where you burn out and then you're overwhelmed, or then you start kind of personalizing the trauma and now you're just in a situation that's a little bit sticky and could be a little bit dangerous. So, make sure that you're also, in a clear headspace, that you're doing what you need to do to serve, and that you're doing positive affirmations, you're taking care of your health, doing what, is best for you, that you're also relying on your loved ones and your inner circle, your support group, your community to make sure that you also are continuing to move forward as you're dealing with trauma. And so, with that said, I hope that, no matter what, you will find goodness in the situation. You will find a way to move forward, and that you will have enough support to get you through those tough times so that you can bounce back. So, thank you so much, guys, for joining this Grit and Equity Talks podcast with Dr. India White. That is going to be featured. Again, it's going to be featured on the X Factor EDU podcast with Dr. Matthew Joseph in the tribe. And so please make sure that you watch out for that. Also, if you're wanting to follow me on social media, my Facebook handle is Miss India White. LinkedIn is The India White. Twitter is Indie Speak and Teach. Instagram is Indie238. YouTube is India White 123. And my TikTok is Dr. India White. So I hope that we're able to really connect. If you're wanting to be on this podcast or you're wanting to schedule a consultation with me, please email me at india.white.123@gmail.com so that I can see how we can work together. So with that said, guys, thanks so much for joining the podcast today. I wish you the best. And I will see you next time. Take care.